As a Y2K baby, I was raised in a time where queer visibility was becoming a lot more normalized. Before I was even interested in young adult aimed media, Ellen DeGeneres had already come out on her sitcom. X-Men had already been lauded as an LGBT allegory, and the inclusion of gay and lesbian couples in television was on the incline. The first teen show I was ever obsessed with was Buffy the Vampire Slayer, which featured both coding and explicit depictions of a lesbian character named Willow and her various love interests. More on that later. As someone who is a member of the LGBT community and a lover of teen shows, the media representation of LGBT characters has been fascinating, alarming, and sometimes even touching to watch develop as we live through the golden age of television. Hello there, my name is Shani, and today I am going to discuss the history of LGBT representation in television. Specifically, I want to take a look at the history of LGBT representation in shows whose target audience is teenagers, the tropes associated with LGBT characters in young adult television, and why positive representation matters. Warning, this video will feature spoilers for several TV shows such as Buffy the Vampire Slayer, Glee, Pretty Little Liars, and Degrassi Next Generation. In 1997, Buffy the Vampire Slayer debuted on the CW. This was not the first teen show to feature an LGBT character in its main cast, but it was one of the first shows of its caliber and popularity. There was plenty of queer coding in Buffy leading up to the episode New Moon Rising, which aired on May 2nd, 2000. Queer coding, for those who may not know, is when a character is heavily applied to be a part of the LGBT community without explicitly stating their sexuality or gender orientation. According to Ritika Joshi of She the People, this technique to portray LGBT characters was developed as a sort of loophole around the restrictions set by the Hays Code back in the early 1900s. When New Moon Rising aired in 2000, the coding of Willow became explicit, and the quiet part was finally said out loud. The audience watched Willow embark on multiple relationships, but most prominently featured was her relationship with Tara. Growing up, this was my favorite TV show of all time, and as a result, this was my favorite TV couple of all time. Though, as an adult, I believe Tara deserved a lot better than Willow. Following these two examples of queer characters coming to light in teen television, there was a sort of influx throughout the early 2000s. Some notable LGBT characters from the early 2000s include Marco Del Rossi in Degrassi Next Generation, Eric Vander Woodson in Gossip Girl, Curtin Blaine in Glee, Brittany and Santana in Glee, and Emily and Naomi in Skins. These portrayals included varying levels of depth for each character and relationship, but most of these characters were at the very least not villainized throughout the duration of their time on the show. The early 2010s continued to introduce plenty of LGBT characters in teen television. Pretty Little Liars, a teen show that was nearly impossible to escape if you were a young adult between the years of 2011 to 2017, featured 2 of their 5 lead characters being LGBT. In addition to this, it was becoming more common for teen shows to feature more than just one LGBT character. By and large, LGBT visibility was becoming more widespread than it had previously been. However, not all that glitters is gold. Before delving into how LGBT representation has evolved over the last 5 years, it's important to understand what common tropes and issues are prevalent in these shows that popularized visibility in teen shows. The most obvious of which is the lack of BIPOC LGBT love stories. In some of the earlier shows I previously talked about, you'd be hard-pressed to find any character who wasn't white. Buffy didn't have a non-white main character in its series until the final season. Gossip Girl almost exclusively follows the lives of white, upper-class teenagers. And while Degrassi tended to cast a little more diversely, the early seasons of the show are infamous for not knowing how to write black characters in an accurate and compelling manner. The limited scope of BIPOC characters in media has also led to a limit of LGBT BIPOC characters. There is an extremely a small amount of Black or Asian LGBT characters represented in television. In 2011, Shay Mitchell and Bianca Lawson starred as Emily Fields and Maya St. Germain. Seeing a Filipino woman and a Black woman in a relationship was not only refreshing, it was needed. Maya and Emily modeled a healthy relationship, which is a rarity for Pretty Little Liars especially. While the relationship was not perfect, this was one show that made a step in the right direction for representation. However, showrunners failed to incorporate inclusive storytelling into their storylines in more ways than one. Notice how none of these characters I mentioned were transgender or bisexual. Trans and bi characters were either played for laughs or completely erased from the narratives of many television shows throughout the early 2000s. This is also true of pretty much any sexuality or gender identity that isn't cis, gay, or lesbian. The lack of representation for these communities in large part helped to invalidate their existence in the minds of many Americans at the time. When trans characters or bi characters were given spotlight in the media, they were either villainized or hypersexualized. Take, for instance, Brittany Pierce from Glee. Most of Brittany's distinguishable character traits have to do with her being unintelligent or her being hypersexualized. Brittany's love interest throughout the show, Santana, invalidates Brittany's bisexuality whenever given the opportunity. Similarly, Kurt gets upset when Blaine questions if he might be bisexual. Unfortunately, even when teen shows would manage to get representation right, they would often still lean on harmful tropes that continued to help with othering the LGBT community. Tell me if this sounds familiar. A queer relationship is introduced. The couple falls deeply in love with each other and seems very happy. And then one of the characters in the relationship dies. Bury Your Gays is part of the enduring trend that continues to perpetuate the idea that LGBT relationships are strife with suffering. Other common storylines enforced by teen-aimed media include depictions of violence that is either perpetrated by or committed against LGBT characters, creating characters who are not properly fleshed out, i.e. tokenism, and showing horrifically homophobic parents. While it is important to represent that violence against LGBT people is very real, this should not be the case with every single relationship on television. In a world where there are countless happy endings for heteronormative couples, it should not be so hard for LGBT couples to get happy endings too. The final problematic trope that bears mentioning is the trope where a straight, cisgendered protagonist learns not to be homophobic or transphobic. This trope tends to tie the LGBT character's journey to the bigoted protagonist's realization that they are harboring prejudice against the LGBT community. Take, for example, Marco's storyline in Degrassi. The first 4 episodes that are Marco-centered all have either an A plot or a B plot that deals with Spinner addressing his homophobic beliefs. Similarly, in Glee, when Kurt and Finn move in together, Finn has a fit about Kurt's room being an expression of himself. Finn's fit largely stems from homophobia. One of Finn's main storylines throughout the rest of Season 1 and persisting into Season 2 involve Finn learning to accept that his stepbrother is gay. The trope where the protagonist learns not to be so bigoted tends to expect the viewer to reward these characters for doing the bare minimum and accepting that LGBT characters exist. Additionally, this trope also has a tendency to make its subject matter seem black and white, rather than acknowledging that overcoming explicit and implicit bias against a person or community takes more than just a couple of months in knowing a queer person. In the later 2010s leading to the present, LGBT visibility and representation has improved vastly. Some shows, such as Degrassi, The Next Generation, and Glee, which I've already discussed, existed long enough to begin overcoming some of the tropes that plagued their show's early representation. Degrassi, for instance, features a bi storyline for Paige, and its Netflix successor, Degrassi Next Class, starts to showcase a truly diverse group in terms of ethnicity, rather than exclusively showcasing cis, white sexuality. Glee manages to not bury any of its primary gays, with both Santana and Brittany, and Kurt and Blaine getting married by the series' end. New shows have also become more diverse and provided better representation for future generations. Heartbreaker and Love Victor are both acclaimed for showcasing queer storylines that aren't painful for an LGBT audience to watch. Meanwhile, shows like Sex Education and Euphoria have struck a chord with audiences and made characters that avoid many of the tropes and problems that the early 2000s shows showcased. I want to make it clear that many of the problems we had in 2000s media still exist, although to a lesser extent. One modern problem that LGBT representation in media has that I hope is overcome is that of tokenism. Tokenism is still persistent in many teen shows and beyond. It's clear that sometimes writers don't know what to do with their queer characters but want to make sure to include them nevertheless. Similarly, I want to address Jules in Euphoria. Her characterization can definitely be interpreted as villainous, whether the writers intended this or not, and as a result, many people do not like her character. This is not to say we cannot have LGBT villains in stories, but villainizing transgender characters in your TV show is definitely punching down. I hope that we can, 1, continue moving forward with progressing our media to be more inclusive, and 2, address the issues still prevalent in media that exist today. In order for this to happen, I think it's important to understand why LGBT visibility and proper representation matters. Queer visibility and inclusion is important and benefits both those who are in the LGBT community and those who are not. While most of the problems that I've discussed persist across all forms of media, I focus on teen shows because the primary audience for teen shows is to an age where many are beginning to explore their identity. If we want to live in a more inclusive society, youth need to be educated about how to live inclusively. By including queer characters in television, we as a society can help in normalizing being queer. This helps LGBT people to not be othered and helps teenagers who are straight and or cisgendered to accept LGBT people as a valid and normal part of the greater society. It is important to show all types of LGBT relationships because not every LGBT relationship is either gay or lesbian. Not every queer person is white, and gender identity is just as valid as sexuality. Everybody deserves to be represented in media and to have characters that they can identify with on screen. By showing positive depictions of LGBT characters, we can stop normalizing violence and suffering of LGBT people. While it is important to acknowledge and portray the plights of those in the LGBT community, not every story needs to focus on this aspect of sexuality. We can both acknowledge the community's oppression and depict a society that does not allow that to continue. It is important to show teenagers that their sexuality is not going to cause them to suffer for the rest of their lives. It is also important to let heteronormative people know that violence against LGBT youth is not okay and should be fought against.